In this video, we're going to revisit the concepts of comparative advantage and gains from trade. First, it's going to be helpful if we make a distinction between absolute and comparative advantage. An individual country is said to have an absolute advantage in a productive task if they can produce more of that good than other individuals or countries can. Alternatively, an individual country is said to have a comparative advantage if they can produce that good at the lowest opportunity cost. So you have an absolute advantage in something if you're better at it than anybody else. You have a comparative advantage if the opportunity cost of you doing that activity is less than it is for other people. Ultimately, as David Ricardo showed in the middle of the 1800s, only comparative advantage matters in terms of where people should specialize. In particular, he showed that the total gains from trade are maximized if each individual country specializes in those activities or those tasks in which they possess a comparative advantage. The easiest way to see this is using an example. Suppose we consider the case of the US and Canada, and let's simplify this by assuming there's only two goods that are going to be traded between the two countries: apples and maple syrup. If the U.S. devotes all of its resources to producing apples, it can produce 400 units of apples. If it devotes all of its resources to producing maple syrup, it could produce 300 units of maple syrup. And we're assuming, again for simplicity, that the production possibilities frontier is linear for both the U.S. and Canada. The two curves on the screen in blue are the production possibilities curves for the U.S. and Canada. Now, to determine who has a comparative advantage, what we need to do is measure the opportunity cost. And let's start by measuring the opportunity cost of producing apples. If the U.S. chooses to produce 400 units of apples, it's giving up 300 units of maple syrup. So the opportunity cost of 400 units of apples is 300 units of maple syrup. If we know that 400 units of apples cost 300 units of maple syrup, 1 unit of apples would cost 1/400th of that, or 300 divided by 400, or 3/4 of a unit of maple syrup. So the opportunity cost of a unit of apples in the U.S. is going to be equal to 3/4 of a unit of maple syrup. In Canada, the numbers were chosen to make this really simple. The opportunity cost of 300 units of apples is 300 units of maple syrup, so the opportunity cost of 1 apple would be 1/300th of that, or just 1 unit of maple syrup. So that would be the opportunity cost of apples in the U.S. and Canada. We said that a country had a comparative advantage in a good if they could produce it at a lower opportunity cost. And because 3/4 is less than 1, we conclude that the U.S. has a comparative advantage in apple production. We can also look at this in terms of maple syrup production. There's two ways of computing this. One is that if we know that 1 unit of apples costs 3/4 of a unit of maple syrup, the opportunity cost of maple syrup is just going to be the reciprocal of that, which would be 4/3 of a unit of apples. But we can also do that by using the same logic we use to compute the opportunity cost of a unit of apples. The opportunity cost of 300 units of maple syrup is 400 units of apples. As a result, the opportunity cost of 1 unit of maple syrup is 1/300th of that, so it would be equal to 400 divided by 300, or 4/3 of a unit of apples. In Canada, the opportunity cost of a unit of maple syrup is equal to 1 unit of apples. So in this case, we see that Canada has a comparative advantage in maple syrup production. And if we have two goods and two countries, one country would always have a comparative advantage in one of those goods, and the other would have a comparative advantage in the other good, unless the opportunity cost just happened to be exactly the same, in which case there'd be no gains from trade. For a country to gain from trade, they have to do better than they would be in the absence of trade. So an individual or country will buy something from someone else only if the cost is below their own opportunity cost of producing the good. This is a very general principle. An electrician might hire someone to mow their lawn if the opportunity cost of them using their own time to mow it is greater than it would be to pay someone else to mow it. So in general, we hire someone else to do work for us if they can do it at a cost that's less than our own opportunity cost, less than the value of the time it would take us to do the task. Similarly, an individual or country will sell something to someone else if they can sell it for something more than it costs them. So you buy things if it's cheaper to buy them than to produce them yourself, and you sell things if you can sell it for more than it costs you to produce it. It's a very basic principle, but that's really all we need to understand gains from trade. What we know is that, using that logic, the opportunity cost of apples in the U.S. was equal to 3/4 of a unit of maple syrup. And Ricardo would suggest the U.S. should specialize in apple production because that's where its comparative advantage lies, but they'd only be willing to sell apples to Canada if they can sell them for more than the opportunity cost of producing the apples. So the U.S. is only going to sell apples, is only going to export apples to Canada if they can trade them for more than 3/4 of a unit of maple syrup. And in that case, the U.S. would gain because they're acquiring more maple syrup than they had given up to produce those apples in the first place. Canada, on the other hand, will be willing to trade maple syrup for apples only if the opportunity cost of the apples is less than what it costs them, which is 1 unit of maple syrup. So what that tells us is that the possible terms of trade between the U.S. and Canada is that 1 unit of apples must be traded for more than 3/4 of a unit of maple syrup for the U.S. to be willing to export it, but less than 1 unit of maple syrup for Canada to be willing to import it. And any trading ratio that's strictly between 3/4 and 1 units of maple syrup for a unit of apples would benefit both the U.S. and Canada. Now, we can illustrate the gains that each country receives. Let's assume that the trading ratio is 0.9 units of maple syrup for 1 unit of apples. So to see the gains from trade that would occur in that case, the U.S. would be able to trade apples for maple syrup and end up with more maple syrup than if they tried producing it domestically. That allows the U.S. to consume above its production possibilities curve. And that's illustrated by that red line in the diagram on the left. Canada is able to specialize in producing maple syrup and to trade that maple syrup for apples, and because it's able to acquire those below the opportunity cost of producing them domestically, it too is able to consume above its production possibilities curve. We can note that the slope of the production possibilities curves represent the opportunity cost of one good in terms of the other. And as long as those slopes are not the same, there's going to be some slope in between, which is flatter than the steeper curve and steeper than the flatter curve, which will allow each country to trade with the other and to consume a bundle of goods that lies above its production possibilities curve. So in general, whenever the opportunity costs differ for producing a good between two countries or between two individuals within a country, there's always going to be some potential gains from trade, which allows each country or each person to consume more than they would if they tried producing everything themselves. That's a very basic principle, but it's one that is still not very widely understood, as we see in so many political discussions about trade restrictions.